Pastor Williams and Elder Thompson requested a private meeting to discuss my spiritual condition that ended with them questioning my faith and worthiness. The text message came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was folding laundry in my cramped apartment. My phone buzzed and I saw Pastor Williams' name pop up. He rarely texted directly, so my heart did that little skip thing it does when something feels off. The message was short and formal, asking if I could meet with him and Elder Thompson after Wednesday evening service to discuss some concerns about my spiritual journey. I stared at the screen for a solid 5 minutes, my hands still clutching a half-folded towel. What concerns? I'd been attending Grace Community Church for almost 3 years now, ever since I moved to the small town for a fresh start after my divorce. I thought I was doing everything right. I showed up every Sunday, participated in Bible study, volunteered for the food pantry twice a month. Sure, I asked questions sometimes, but wasn't that what we were supposed to do? Seek understanding? Wednesday dragged by like molasses. I couldn't concentrate at work, kept checking my phone, wondering what I'd done wrong. During lunch, I sat in my car eating a sad sandwich and replaying every interaction I'd had at church recently. There was last week's Bible study where I'd questioned the interpretation of a particular passage about women's roles. I hadn't been disrespectful, just curious about the historical context. Then there was the time I'd suggested we might consider supporting the local homeless shelter even though they didn't require residents to attend religious services. Was that what this was about? The evening service felt endless. I sat in my usual spot, third pew from the back on the left side, trying to focus on Pastor Williams' sermon about spiritual growth and obedience. His eyes seemed to find mine more often than usual, and I wondered if I was imagining the weight behind his gaze. Elder Thompson sat in the front row as always, his silver hair perfectly combed, his posture rigid with the kind of authority that came from decades of church leadership. After the final hymn and closing prayer, people began filing out with their usual chatter about weekend plans and upcoming church events. I lingered, my palms sweating as I watched families gather their children and elderly members slowly make their way to the parking lot. Finally, Pastor Williams approached me with that practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. The walk to his office felt like a death march. The hallway seemed longer than usual, lined with faded photographs of past church events and inspirational quotes in cheap frames. Elder Thompson was already seated when we arrived, his hands folded on the small conference table that had seen countless meetings about church budgets and community outreach programs. Pastor Williams closed the door with a soft click that sounded final. He didn't offer me coffee or water, didn't make small talk about the weather or ask about my week. Instead, he settled into his chair across from me and exchanged a meaningful look with Elder Thompson before clearing his throat. The conversation that followed felt like being slowly dismantled, piece by piece. They spoke in measured tones, using words like concerning patterns and spiritual immaturity. Pastor Williams mentioned my tendency to ask probing questions during Bible study, suggesting it demonstrated a lack of faith and trust in established teachings. Elder Thompson nodded along, adding that several congregation members had expressed feeling uncomfortable with my challenging attitude. I sat there feeling smaller and smaller, like I was shrinking into the uncomfortable plastic chair. They questioned whether I truly understood what it meant to be part of their faith community. They suggested that my independent thinking was actually pride in disguise, a spiritual failing that could lead others astray. Elder Thompson leaned forward, his voice taking on a paternal tone that somehow made everything worse, and suggested that perhaps I would be more comfortable in a different congregation, one that might be more suited to my particular spiritual needs. The words hit me like physical blows. I'd thought I'd found a home here, a place where I belonged after years of feeling adrift. I'd genuinely grown to care about these people, had celebrated their joys and mourned their losses alongside them. The elderly woman who always saved me a seat when I was running late, the young mother who'd confided in me about her struggles with postpartum depression, the teenagers who actually seemed to enjoy our youth group discussions about faith and real life. My throat felt tight and I could feel tears threatening to spill over. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that my questions came from a place of genuine seeking, not rebellion. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just nodded and mumbled something about understanding their concerns and needing time to think about what they'd said. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I kept replaying their words, dissecting every interaction I'd had with church members, wondering if I'd been blind to signs of their disapproval. Had I really been such a negative influence? Was my faith really so weak that it threatened others? I spent the next few days in a fog of self-doubt and hurt. I called in sick to work on Thursday, unable to face the thought of normal interactions when everything inside me felt raw and exposed. I kept drafting and deleting text messages to church friends, wanting to reach out but afraid of confirmation that they too saw me as a spiritual failure. Friday evening brought another surprise. I was sitting on my couch in my pajamas, halfway through a pint of ice cream and feeling sorry for myself when my doorbell rang. I almost didn't answer it, not ready to face whatever new judgment awaited me. But curiosity won out and I shuffled to the door in my slippers. Pastor Williams and Elder Thompson stood on my small porch, looking oddly sheepish. Pastor Williams was holding a small bouquet of flowers and Elder Thompson had what appeared to be a cake box from the local bakery. They asked if they could come in, and something in their demeanor was so different from Wednesday night that I found myself stepping aside to let them enter. What happened next completely upended everything I thought I knew about that painful meeting. They sat on my couch, looking more human than I'd ever seen them, and began to explain that Wednesday night had been an elaborate test. Not a cruel joke or power play, but a carefully planned evaluation of my spiritual maturity and leadership potential. Elder Thompson explained that they'd been watching me for months, impressed by the thoughtful questions I asked and the genuine care I showed for other congregation members. They'd noticed how younger members gravitated toward me during discussions, how I listened without judgment when people shared their struggles. But they needed to know if I had the spiritual backbone to stand firm in my convictions when challenged. Pastor Williams admitted they borrowed the technique from his mentor who'd used similar tests to identify potential leaders in his own congregation years ago. They wanted to see if I would crumble under pressure or if I had the inner strength necessary for spiritual leadership. They were looking for someone who could handle criticism and opposition with grace, someone who could maintain their faith even when authority figures questioned it. The revelation left me speechless. Part of me was relieved that my church family didn't actually see me as a spiritual failure. But another part was angry at the manipulation, the unnecessary pain they'd caused. I told them how their words had affected me, how I'd spent days questioning everything about myself and my faith journey. They listened with genuine remorse, acknowledging that their method had been harsh and possibly misguided. Elder Thompson's eyes actually filled with tears as he described watching me leave the office that night, seeing the hurt in my shoulders and second-guessing their entire approach. Pastor Williams admitted they'd debated calling me the very next day to explain, but had wanted to see how I processed the experience first. The conversation that followed was unlike any I'd ever had with church leadership. We talked about doubt and faith, about the difference between questioning and rebellion, about what it truly meant to be a spiritual leader. They shared their own struggles with faith, times when they'd wrestled with God and Scripture and come out stronger on the other side. They formally asked if I would consider taking on a leadership role in the church, specifically helping to guide the young adult ministry and mentoring newer members who might benefit from my questioning approach to faith. They wanted someone who could create a safe space for spiritual exploration, who understood that doubt and seeking were part of the journey, not obstacles to it. Update 1. I told them I needed time to think about their offer, and they respected that completely. The next few weeks felt like walking through a completely different world. Sunday services took on new meaning as I watched the congregation with fresh eyes, noticing things I'd missed before. The way certain members seemed to hold back during discussions, the hunger for deeper conversation in younger faces, the relief when someone finally voiced a question others were afraid to ask. The young adult group became my testing ground. I started facilitating discussions differently, creating space for the kinds of questions I'd always wanted to ask. We talked about faith in real terms, about how to maintain belief when life fell apart, about what it meant to love your neighbor when your neighbor held completely different political views. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People who'd been silent for months started opening up. A college student shared her struggles with depression and how it affected her relationship with God. A newlywed couple talked about the challenges of building a spiritual life together when they'd been raised in different denominations. A single mom confessed her fears about raising her children with faith in a world that often seemed to mock religious belief. But not everyone was thrilled with the changes. Some of the older members began expressing concerns about the direction of our discussions. I overheard whispered conversations about young people being led astray, about the importance of accepting faith without question. One particularly vocal member approached Pastor Williams after a service where we'd discussed the biblical perspective on social justice, suggesting that I was promoting dangerous liberal ideas. The pushback was harder to handle than I'd expected. These were people I'd grown to care about, whose wisdom and experience I respected. Having them view my approach as spiritually dangerous felt like a betrayal all over again. I started second-guessing myself, wondering if I was indeed leading people away from traditional faith rather than deeper into it. The breaking point came during a particularly heated discussion about biblical interpretation. An older gentleman who'd been attending the church for 40 years stood up in the middle of our session and declared that asking too many questions was a sign of weak faith. He suggested that true believers simply accepted what Scripture taught without needing to understand every detail or historical context. The room fell silent. I could feel every eye on me waiting to see how I'd respond. Part of me wanted to apologize, to smooth things over and return to safer topics. But I thought about Pastor Williams and Elder Thompson's test, about what they'd said about spiritual backbone and standing firm in convictions. I took a deep breath and shared my own story about the night I'd been called into that office and told I was a spiritual failure. I talked about how that experience had nearly destroyed my faith, but had ultimately strengthened it by forcing me to examine what I truly believed rather than what I thought I was supposed to believe. I explained that questions weren't the enemy of faith, but often its closest companion. The older gentleman left halfway through my response, along with 2 other members. I watched them go with a heavy heart, knowing that my approach to spiritual leadership would always be controversial, would always push some people away even as it drew others closer. Update 2. The church split that followed wasn't dramatic or explosive, but it was definitive. About a third of the congregation, mostly older members, began attending services less frequently or transferred to other churches in the area. The remaining members seemed to settle into a new rhythm, one that embraced both traditional faith and thoughtful questioning. Pastor Williams and Elder Thompson stood firmly behind my approach, even when it cost them some longtime members and a portion of their weekly offerings. They'd begun implementing similar discussion-based approaches in other areas of church life, and while it was messy and sometimes uncomfortable, they believed it was leading to a deeper, more authentic faith community. My role evolved beyond what any of us had initially envisioned. I found myself counseling people through doubts and crises of faith, helping them understand that spiritual struggle was normal and often necessary for growth. I worked with parents who were afraid their children would abandon faith entirely if they were allowed to ask hard questions, showing them how to create safe spaces for exploration at home. The most challenging case was a teenage girl whose parents were convinced she was becoming an atheist because she'd started questioning some of the stories she'd grown up with. They wanted me to convince her to stop asking questions and just believe. Instead, I spent months walking alongside her as she wrestled with concepts of faith, science, history, and personal belief. It was terrifying and beautiful to watch someone construct their own understanding of spirituality rather than simply inheriting it. She didn't emerge from that process with the same faith her parents held, but she emerged with something that was genuinely hers. Her questions led her to a deeper appreciation for mystery, for the parts of existence that couldn't be easily explained or categorized. Her parents struggled with her evolving beliefs, but they couldn't deny the peace and purpose she'd found through her questioning journey. The experience taught me that spiritual leadership wasn't about having all the answers or maintaining everyone's comfort. It was about creating space for people to encounter the divine in their own way, even if that way looked different from traditional expressions of faith. Final update. 2 years later, our little church had transformed into something none of us could have predicted. We'd lost some members, but we'd gained others, people who'd been searching for a faith community that allowed for complexity and doubt alongside belief and certainty. Our youth group had tripled in size, filled with young people who'd been turned off by rigid religious structures but were hungry for spiritual connection. The most unexpected development was the relationships that formed across generational lines. Some of the older members who'd initially resisted the changes began engaging with the questions younger members brought forward. They shared wisdom gained through decades of life experience while learning to see their faith through fresh eyes. It wasn't always comfortable, but it was alive in a way that felt authentic and sustainable. I often thought back to that terrible night in Pastor Williams' office, to the way their words had shattered my sense of belonging and worth. The memory still stung, but I'd come to understand it as a necessary breaking that had allowed something new to grow. Not everyone needed such a dramatic test of their spiritual convictions, but for me, it had been exactly what I needed to discover who I was meant to be as a person of faith. The most profound realization came during a quiet moment one Sunday morning. I was setting up chairs for our discussion group when an elderly woman approached me, someone who'd been initially skeptical of my leadership style. She told me that watching me navigate criticism and doubt had given her permission to admit her own spiritual struggles for the first time in decades. She'd spent years pretending to have unwavering faith when she actually wrestled with questions and uncertainties daily. That conversation helped me understand that the test Pastor Williams and Elder Thompson had put me through wasn't really about my worthiness for leadership. It was about discovering whether I could model authentic faith for others, whether I could show that questioning and believing weren't opposite forces but dance partners in the spiritual life. The leadership position I'd accepted had evolved into something much more complex and rewarding than I'd ever imagined. I wasn't just facilitating discussions or organizing programs. I was helping people discover that faith could be both deeply personal and genuinely communal, both historically rooted and constantly evolving, both comforting and challenging. Looking back, I realized that the most important thing I'd learned wasn't about church leadership or spiritual authority. It was about the courage to remain curious, to keep asking questions even when the answers weren't comfortable or convenient. The night I'd been called a spiritual failure had actually been the beginning of my real spiritual journey, one that embraced both doubt and faith as essential elements of a life lived in honest relationship with the divine. Our church had become a place where people could bring their whole selves, including the parts that didn't fit neatly into traditional religious categories. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't for everyone, but it was real in a way that felt like coming home after a long journey through unfamiliar territory. The test that had once seemed so cruel had ultimately revealed the kind of spiritual leader I was meant to be, not despite my questions and struggles, but because of them. Sometimes the most painful experiences become the foundation for the most meaningful growth, and sometimes what feels like an ending is actually just the beginning of something much more beautiful and complex than you could have imagined.